The ranch sat at the edge of nowhere, where the horizon stretched wide and endless under a sky that could turn from pale blue to storm gray in a matter of hours. Dust swirled across the dry plains like tiny, restless ghosts, and the wind always seemed to carry a warning. It was a land that did not forgive weakness, nor did it tolerate idleness. And at the center of it all, living alone in a weathered farmhouse, was Josiah Kane, the rancher. Josiah was a man carved from the same earth. He worked. His hands were calloused, thick from years of mending fences, brandishing calves, and hauling feed in the blistering sun. His face was lined deeply, not with age alone, but with experience troubles faced and overcome in silence. Gray-streaked, his once black hair and his eyes, a piercing blue, could freeze a man mid-sentence, not from malice but from the sheer intensity of their observation. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words were measured, carrying the weight of someone who had learned that careless talk could be costly in a world as harsh as this. Life on the ranch was routine, brutal and unforgiving, yet Josiah thrived in it. Dawn saw him walking the perimeter, inspecting the fences for any breach that could let a calf wander off into the empty expanse. By midday, he was in the barn, coiling ropes and guiding the cattle with a patience that belied his gruff exterior. Evenings found him by the fireplace, a cup of black coffee in hand, staring into the flames with a contemplative frown. He had friends once, but distance and circumstance had whittled them away. Now his only companions were the animals, the wind and the whisper of the plains. Despite his stoicism, there was a part of Josiah that was quietly haunted. Every once in a while, when the wind bent the trees at impossible angles, or a coyote's howl carried further than it should, he felt an unease he could not shake. It was as though the land itself carried secrets, memories of misfortune, of travelers lost to the wilderness, or of something waiting beyond the edges of sight. He dismissed it often, attributing it to the imagination or the long solitude, but deep down, a seed of apprehension had been planted, one that he had learned to live alongside. Josiah's neighbors were few and far between, and visits were rare. Letters arrived infrequently, their envelopes yellowed, the ink fading. People in town called him gruff, stubborn, maybe even unreachable, but Josiah didn't mind. He didn't need the chatter of others to fill his days. There was a rhythm. To the ranch, a pulse in the work itself, that was enough to sustain him. His days were defined by tangible achievements, the repaired fence, the milked cows, the grain stored properly in the silo, not by meaningless pleasantries or idle gossip. Yet that isolation, though chosen, had a price. Loneliness had a way of creeping into the corners of the mind, a shadow that moved with the sun, quiet but persistent. Sometimes Josiah would imagine what it would be like to have another presence in the house, a voice, a smile, a laugh echoing through the halls. But the thought never lasted. He knew that the world he lived in did not easily allow for softness, for attachments. The land was merciless, and anyone who depended on it too heavily could find themselves paying a steep price. It was late afternoon when Josiah finally paused by the corral, wiping the sweat from his brow. The sky had begun to darken, clouds rolling in from the west in thick, roiling masses. A storm was coming, though he could not yet feel it in the air. He tightened his coat around him and scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing. In the distance, the wind lifted dust like a living thing, bending the prairie grasses, pushing them to the ground. Josiah felt a familiar stirring in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and unease, yet he did not flinch. He had faced harsher days and harsher nights. As the first drops of rain splattered the dry earth, Josiah turned back toward the farmhouse. The firewood was stacked, the lamps ready. He moved with a purpose honed over decades, aware that storms here were more than whether they were tests of endurance, of patience, of preparation. And in that moment, alone on the edge of the world, Josiah Kane embodied the rugged, unwavering spirit of the land he called home. But even as he stepped inside, he did not know that this particular storm would bring more than wind or rain. Something, or someone, was coming, something that would challenge not just his strength, but the very life he had built in isolation. And Josiah, for all his experience, would soon discover that the plains held secrets far darker than the storms themselves. Storm hit hard, faster than Josiah had anticipated. Rain pelted the tin roof like a drum, a relentless hammering that made the farmhouse shiver. Lightning fractured the sky in blinding streaks, followed almost immediately by booming thunder that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the house. Josiah moved methodically, checking the windows, securing the barn doors, and making sure the animals had shelter. He had weathered storms before, countless times, and yet there was a tension in this one, a weight in the air that made him pause and glance toward the dark horizon. It was then that he saw her. At first, she was just a shadow, hunched against the wind, stumbling across the muddy field. Rain plastered her dark hair to her face, soaking her clothes to the point they clung to her like a second skin. She was small, slight, and entirely out of place in the unforgiving plains. The wind tore at her, whipping her forward in desperate, uneven steps, and she seemed barely aware of her surroundings. As if driven by some primal instinct to escape, Josiah instinctively grabbed a heavy coat from the hook by the door and ran. Outside, boots sinking into the soft, rain-slicked ground. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "You'll catch your death out here." The woman looked up, her face half hidden by the rain and her hair, and Josiah caught the first glimpse of her eyes wide, terrified, and darting as if she were seeing things only she could perceive. "Please," she gasped, her voice a fragile whisper lost against the roar of the storm. "Don't send me back." Josiah froze for a heartbeat. Those words carried a weight he could not immediately understand. "Back? Back where?" he asked, stepping closer, but she shook her head violently, pressing her hands to her ears as though to block out some unseen horror. I can't go back there." "Please." Her desperation was raw, primal, a sound that cut through the storm itself. Josiah's instincts told him she was in danger, though danger of what, he could not yet say. Without thinking further, he wrapped the coat around her, pulling her close to shelter her from the wind. She shivered violently, and he noticed how thin and fragile she seemed, almost too delicate to survive the harsh elements of the plains. "Come on, get inside," he urged, guiding her toward the farmhouse. Her steps were unsteady, but she followed him, eyes still wide. Darting to every shadow the storm threw across the porch. Inside, Josiah quickly closed the door against the wind, letting the warmth of the house hit her soaked body. She sank to the floor, exhausted, her knees trembling as she buried her face in her hands. He fetched a towel and set it on her lap, then poured a cup of strong black coffee, the steam rising in the dim light of the kitchen. "Drink this," he said gently, setting the cup down before her. She stared at it like it was an alien object, hands hovering, unsure if she was allowed to touch it. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she took a sip, the warmth doing little to soothe the chill in her bones. Josiah studied her in silence. There was something unusual about her, something that set her apart from the travelers and drifters who occasionally crossed the plains. The way she flinched at sounds, the constant twitch of her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink even in the small, well-lit kitchen, it all spoke of someone who had known fear in ways most people could never understand. Finally, she lifted her head, eyes meeting his for the first time with clarity. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They'll come if I go back. You don't know what they do." Josiah, ever pragmatic, narrowed his eyes. Who's coming? And why? Should I believe you? He wasn't cruel. He just didn't waste his energy on panic without proof. She shook her head, tears mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. I can't explain. Not yet. But please, just let me stay. For tonight, please. There was something in her tone, a raw sincerity laced with terror that made Josiah hesitate. He had lived alone for years, trusting no one but himself and the land. And yet, despite that ingrained caution, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: responsibility, perhaps, or the faint echo of empathy. Finally, he nodded, more to himself than to her. All right, you stay. But you follow my rules. You don't wander, you don't touch the animals, and you don't open the doors. Understand? She nodded quickly, relief flooding her face. Thank you, thank you. Josiah could feel the storm pressing against the walls, rattling the windows as if warning him that tonight would be unlike any other. And as he moved to start the fire, he had no way of knowing that the arrival of this frightened, desperate woman would unravel a sequence of events that would shake the very foundation of his isolated life. Outside, the wind continued to howl. Somewhere in the distance, lightning struck the plains, a sharp, blinding reminder that even in a place as remote as this, darkness could arrive without warning, and sometimes it brought more than rain. She stayed on the floor, knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the flames flickering in the hearth. Every time the wind rattled the windows, she flinched, a tiny shiver running through her entire body. Josiah poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich, bitter aroma filling the kitchen, and leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. He wasn't used to having anyone in his house, certainly not someone so fragile. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice trembling. Please, don't send me back, she repeated, her words almost a chant. She buried her face in her hands as though hiding from something he could not see. They'll find me. And if they do, she trailed off, shaking, and Josiah felt a chill creep down his spine, even though the fire burned bright. Who's going to find you? He asked, cautious. He had learned long ago that people often said frightening things in moments of fear, and most of the time, those things weren't real. But there was something in the way she said it, a raw urgency that made him pause. They won't. Stop, she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't explain it, not now. But if I go back, if they get me, I won't survive, please. Her eyes met his, wide and pleading, brimming with desperation. It wasn't the kind of fear Josiah had seen before. It was deeper, more consuming, like a shadow that had followed her for years. He knelt slowly in front of her, keeping his voice steady. I need you to tell me something I can understand. Are you running from a person? A group? Something else? She shook her head violently. I can't. They'll know. Even speaking it, they'll know. Her hands clutched at the fabric of her soaked clothes, twisting the material in a nervous rhythm. I've spent years trying to hide. I thought I was safe. I thought no one would ever find me. But I was wrong. Josiah's brow furrowed. He had seen fear before, but this was different. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of something far worse, something that left a mark on the mind, leaving the soul raw and exposed. He could feel it radiating off her, palpable and oppressive, and it made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Why here? He asked slowly, his tone neutral but probing. Why come to me? You don't know me. You don't know this land. Why risk crossing all that open ground in the middle of a storm? She swallowed hard, her throat tight. Because I could feel it, she said, almost in a whisper. Something drew me. Something told me you'd protect me. Or at least, I hoped you would. I had nowhere else to go. I ran as far as I could. I ran, and I had nowhere left to hide. The fire crackled, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm battering against the walls. Josiah studied her, every twitch, every fearful glance toward the dark corners of the room. There was no pretense here, no attempt to manipulate. This was raw, unfiltered terror. And yet, he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was more she wasn't telling him. Something hidden, something dangerous. You'll have to trust me, he said finally. His voice was firm, carrying authority. I don't know what's chasing you, and I don't know what will happen if they find you. But if you're going to stay, you follow my rules. You stay inside, you don't wander. You don't touch the animals. You don't, I understand. She interrupted quickly, desperation lending speed to her words. I'll do anything. Just, please, don't send me back. Not yet. Not tonight, I beg you. Josiah nodded slowly. The weight of her plea hung heavy in the room. He was used to making hard choices on this ranch, choices that could mean life or death. He had faced storms, fires, predatory animals, and human threats. But this was different. Protecting someone from an unknown danger carried risks he could barely measure. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt a responsibility. Beyond fences, cattle, and the relentless demands of the land. Fine, he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. You stay, but I need to know. I need to understand at least a little before I can truly protect you. Her lips trembled, and she nodded, pressing her hands against her face again. I can't tell you everything. Not yet, but if you let me stay, you won't regret it. Please, I won't be any trouble. I need tonight. Just tonight. Josiah studied her for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes searching for any hint of deceit. There was none. Only fear, only urgency, only a fragile human being standing on the edge of the world, begging for refuge. He sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. All right, he said. Tonight, you stay. But understand this, if anything happens. If I sense danger coming near this ranch, I won't hesitate. You'll have to face it with me. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, collapsing slightly into relief. Thank you. Thank you, she whispered, her voice small, almost breaking. Josiah moved toward the fireplace, starting to tend it so the room would warm. He didn't yet know what he had agreed to or what the consequences would be. But one thing was clear. The storm outside had brought more than rain. It had brought a desperate soul into his home, and with her, the quiet, predictable world he had built on the plains was about to change forever. The fire crackled, filling the small farmhouse with warmth, yet the wind outside rattled the windows as if testing their defenses. Josiah moved about the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades mastering his own domain, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The woman crouched near the hearth, knees drawn up, shivering even as the heat began to touch her skin. Her eyes tracked him constantly, wide and unblinking, every shadow, every sound amplified in her perception. Josiah poured himself another cup of coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if the swirling depths could offer clarity. He was a man of routine, of tangible certainties, the fences, the livestock, the daily chores. And yet, here was a variable he could not control, a human being whose fear radiated like heat off a fire. He didn't know her, didn't know what had driven her to this remote ranch, and certainly didn't know the nature of the danger she claimed was pursuing her. Yet, for reasons he could not name, he felt the unshakable instinct that to turn her away now would be far worse than any storm, any threat he had ever faced. He approached her slowly, setting his coffee down on the small wooden table. "You're going to have to tell me your name," he said, his voice low, steady, not harsh but firm. I can't protect you if I don't even know who I'm talking to. She flinched at the question, her hands rising to cover her face again. Names don't matter, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I can't tell you. Not yet. Please, just let me stay tonight. That's all I ask, Josiah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had faced stubborn cattle, enraged wolves, and men with violent intent. He had never faced a human so determined to keep the smallest piece of themselves hidden. All right, he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. Tonight you stay, but you follow my rules. You don't wander. You don't touch the animals. You stay in this room until I say otherwise. Do you understand? Her shoulders relaxed. Slightly, a tiny flicker of relief in her expression. Yes. Yes, I understand. Josiah nodded, moving to check the windows one by one. The storm raged outside, the wind bending the trees in impossible angles, lightning slicing the sky in jagged white streaks. The world outside seemed alive, chaotic, and dangerous, a mirror of the fear that clung to the woman in his kitchen. He felt a strange tension knot in his chest, a mixture of unease and resolve. He had chosen to protect her, but he did not yet understand the full weight of that choice. The hours passed slowly. Josiah kept a careful watch over her, noticing every twitch, every flinch, every glance toward the shadows in the room. There were moments when her fear was so raw it seemed to hang in the air like smoke, filling every corner of the farmhouse. He caught her trembling one time as the wind slammed a branch against the window frame, and he realized just how fragile she was, how completely at the mercy of whatever had driven her here. Yet, despite her terror, there was something unspoken. In her presence, a plea for trust that resonated with something deep inside him. Josiah had spent a lifetime relying on himself, building walls both literal and metaphorical around his life. And now, without choice or desire, he was lowering some of those walls, opening himself to the responsibility of another human being in a way he hadn't for decades. He moved around the room, stacking firewood, checking supplies, preparing for the night ahead. Every sound outside, branches cracking, the low hum of wind through the plains, made him alert. He could feel the tension coiling in his muscles, the instinctive readiness of a man who had survived countless dangers in isolation. And yet, he kept glancing at her, watching the way she flinched at every sound, feeling the weight of her vulnerability pressing against him like a physical presence. Finally, as the storm reached its apex, lightning flashing almost continuously across the sky, he sat down across from her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unsaid words and unspoken fears. I don't know what's out there, he admitted quietly, and I don't know what's chasing you. But I do know this tonight, while that storm rages, you're not going anywhere. You're staying here. And I'll do everything I can to make sure nothing touches you. Her eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude and fear warring within them. Thank you, she whispered again, her voice raw and trembling. I can't explain it, but I feel safe here. Just for now. Josiah nodded, a mixture of unease and resolve settling over him. He had chosen to protect her, to take responsibility for a stranger in a world that offered no guarantees. The storm outside was only the beginning. He knew that. The true danger, whatever it was, would not wait for the dawn to pass. And as he watched her curled near the fire, eyes wide and alert, he understood that this night would mark the first step into a reality far darker and more unpredictable than any storm he had ever weathered. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, battering the farmhouse walls and carrying a promise that the night was far from over. Inside, Josiah Kane had made a choice. Protecting her meant risking everything he had built and perhaps everything he thought he knew about the world. Storm outside had faded to a steady drizzle, leaving the ranch cloaked in a damp, heavy silence. Josiah moved about the farmhouse, checking on the animals and tidying up, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman, who had remained quiet since their uneasy truce, was now pacing, or rather, hovering near the far corner of the kitchen, never sitting for long, never allowing herself to relax. It started with small things. She refused to look into mirrors, turning away whenever her reflection caught the dim firelight. When Josiah set a cup down for her, she flinched as if startled by its presence. She avoided touching the windows, even when the glass fogged from the heat inside and the cold rain outside. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind through the cracks, the distant lowing of the cattle made her jump, her body coiling like a spring ready to snap. Josiah watched her carefully, a mix of curiosity and unease knotting in his chest. He had dealt with fear before, men afraid of losing their fortunes, children afraid of the dark, but this was different. Her fear wasn't situational. It wasn't something that could be soothed by logic or comfort. It was as though she carried an invisible weight, a constant tension that radiated from her in waves, touching everything around her. "She doesn't sleep much," he muttered to himself, noticing that she stayed awake well past midnight, sitting in the dim light by the fire, knees drawn up, eyes scanning every shadow. Something's chasing her, or she thinks something is. The next morning, the behavior grew stranger. While Josiah tended the animals in the barn, she refused to enter, standing at the threshold and glancing nervously toward the dark corners where the livestock moved. She didn't touch the feed or help in any way, merely hovering, her gaze darting as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. When he called her to eat, she hesitated, glancing at the doorway as if checking for unseen threats before. Stepping inside, "You need to eat," Josiah said firmly, though his voice carried the patience of a man who had faced worse obstinacy in animals than in humans. I can't," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Not yet. I need to." "Be sure." Josiah frowned, setting the tray down and studying her. "Be sure of what? There's nothing here that'll hurt you." "Nothing except me, and I don't bite." She gave a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You don't understand. You can't see them. You don't see what I see." That was the first time he noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, how her fingers twitched when she thought no one was watching, how she occasionally muttered words under her breath, low and hurried, like a ritual. She avoided the corners of rooms, avoided shadows on the walls, and never, ever looked out the windows if she could help it. Even her reflection in the silver coffee pot made her flinch, and she would quickly avert her gaze. By the second day, Josiah realized that her fear wasn't just paranoia, it was protective. She wasn't reckless or careless. She was hyper-aware. Every small object, every sound, every movement seemed to register in her mind as potentially threatening. He noticed that she avoided stepping on certain cracks in the floorboards, avoided certain spots in the rooms as if the very space itself carried danger. "She's hiding something," he muttered to himself, more statement than question. "Not from me, from them, or maybe from herself." Josiah began to notice other oddities. She never slept through the night, often sitting silently in the dark, muttering half-formed sentences. She never asked for warmth or comfort, even when the fire dwindled low. And there was an unease in the air whenever she entered a room, the kind of unspoken tension that made him glance over his shoulder, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Even the animals sensed it. The horses and cattle, usually docile, would occasionally stiffen when she passed nearby, ears flicking, eyes wide. Josiah didn't fully understand it, but the effect was undeniable. The ranch, normally predictable in its rhythms, seemed to shift subtly in her presence, as if her fear, her vigilance, were reshaping the very space around her. By evening, Josiah sat in his chair, sipping coffee, and finally voiced what he had been thinking for hours. "I don't know what you are hiding, or what's chasing you. But I can tell one thing, you're not just scared of the world. You're scared of something else, something worse." She didn't answer at first. She just stared into the fire, silent, hands wrapped around her knees. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of unspoken terror. "If they find me, if they ever find me, it won't just be death. It'll be worse." Josiah felt a chill creep up his spine, a mixture of fear and resolve. He had promised to protect her, but now he understood that protecting her would mean confronting a danger far beyond the ordinary. And as he looked at her, tense and trembling, he realized that the next few nights on this ranch would be unlike any he had ever endured. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, the horizon dark and brooding. Inside, a woman's fear had begun to twist the very air, and Josiah Kane knew, with a sinking certainty, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. The morning after the second night, Josiah couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had settled deep in his chest. The woman had remained silent through the night, muttering to herself in low, urgent tones whenever she thought he wasn't listening. She had stayed close to the fire, shifting occasionally, her eyes never leaving the shadows. Even the wind seemed quieter this morning, as if the world itself sensed the tension inside the farmhouse. Josiah went about his morning routine, checking fences and feeding the livestock, but his eyes kept flicking toward the farmhouse door. Something about her behavior, the intensity of her fear, told him she wasn't merely running from ordinary threats. And then he noticed it, the strange markings in the mud near the edge of the barn, deep and uneven as if something or someone had been dragging a heavy object across the ground. The patterns didn't resemble any animal tracks he had seen, and they were too deliberate to be random. He crouched, inspecting them closely. There were gouges, shallow but jagged, forming an odd shape that felt unnatural. He ran his fingers along one, noting the consistency of the soil. The marks led toward the dense tree line at the edge of his property and then disappeared, swallowed by the tall grass. The ranch had been his domain for decades, and he knew these lands intimately. Whatever had made these marks had not been here before, or at least, not in any form he recognized. Returning to the farmhouse, he found the woman sitting silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and alert, as though she could sense he had discovered something. "What is it?" she asked cautiously. Josiah said nothing at first, studying her. "These marks near the barn. Do you know anything about them?" She froze, a flicker of fear or perhaps recognition crossing her face. She shook her head slowly. I don't know. I didn't make them." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the tension of someone trying to convince both herself and him of her words. Josiah didn't press further, though suspicion coiled in his gut. There was something she wasn't telling him, and whatever it was connected to the marks, to her fear, to the unspoken danger lurking in the shadows. Throughout the day, more signs emerged. The barn door, which he had secured the night before, showed scratches along its edge, shallow but deliberate, as if something had tried to pry it open. The livestock seemed nervous, more than usual, shifting restlessly, ears flicking toward the tree line as if listening for an unseen threat. Even the wind carried an odd quality, a low, almost whispering hum that made Josiah's skin crawl. By evening, he decided to investigate further. Armed with a lantern and a stout walking stick, he ventured toward the tree line. The air was damp and thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The markings were still visible, faint but unmistakable, tracing a path from the barn into the dense woods. The deeper he went, the more a sense of unease settled over him. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf seemed amplified, and he could almost feel a presence following him. Unseen yet undeniably there. When he returned to the farmhouse, the woman was waiting by the door, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "You saw them," she said softly. There was no accusation in her tone, only recognition and fear. "I did," Josiah replied cautiously. "I don't know what made them, but whatever it wasn't ordinary, and it's here." Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the table. They found the place," she whispered. "It's only a matter of time now. I've hidden for so long. I thought I was safe, but—" Her voice faltered and she pressed her face into her hands, shaking. Josiah felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of concern and frustration. He had promised to protect her, but now it was clear that danger was already closer than he had imagined. The storm outside had faded, but the real storm, the one he couldn't see, was closing in fast. He moved to stand beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever they are, whatever's coming, we'll deal with it together," he said. Firmly, his voice carried authority, but beneath it lay the recognition of the unknown. He had faced predators, fire, and storms before, but this was different. This threat was cunning, patient, and unseen. The woman nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't lessened. I hope you mean that," she whispered, "because if you don't, if they get here, you won't survive this either." Josiah swallowed hard. Her words were not idle threats, they were warnings, and they carried the weight of someone who had faced horrors he could not yet comprehend. And as he stared out the window toward the dense tree line where the marks had begun, he realized that protecting her would demand everything he had, and perhaps more than that. Outside, the wind stirred once again, carrying with it an ominous whisper that seemed almost alive. The ranch, silent and steadfast for decades, felt different now, taut with anticipation, as if it too knew that a shadow had crept across its fields and that nothing would ever be the same again. The night came suddenly, blanketing the ranch. In near total darkness, broken only by the weak glow of the farmhouse windows and the occasional flash of lightning from a distant storm, Josiah had double-checked the locks and secured the animals in the barn. Every sound, the creak of the quincha, floorboards, the whisper of wind through the trees, even the faint rustle of leaves, set his nerves on edge. But he had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the danger. The woman sat near the fire, knees drawn up, hands clasped tightly, eyes wide and alert. She flinched at every sound, every subtle shift in the house. Josiah kept glancing at her, noting the tension coiled in her body. She wasn't just scared, she was anticipating something, bracing for it. And judging by the marks in the mud and the scratches on the barn, her instincts were correct. The danger was close. It began as a sound so faint he might have dismissed it if not for her reaction. A scraping, almost imperceptible, against the outer walls of the barn. She stiffened, her breath catching. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can feel them. I told you they wouldn't wait." Josiah moved to the window, peering through the darkness. Shapes shifted near the tree line, quick and shadowed, moving with an unnatural precision. He couldn't see faces, couldn't see weapons, but he could sense intent, a calculated menace that sent a shiver down his spine. "Stay here," he ordered. His voice was steady, commanding. She nodded, her eyes wide, and sank lower near the fire, covering her head with her arms. He grabbed a lantern and a stout walking stick, stepping outside into the cold night. Rain had begun to fall again, dampening the earth and making every footstep splash. The shadows in the tree line seemed to stretch, bending and twisting unnaturally as if watching him. He approached the barn cautiously, lantern held high, and noticed the faint outlines of figures slipping between the trees. They moved deliberately, silently, almost floating across the wet grass. "Who's there?" he called, voice firm, carrying. Across the open space. Silence answered him, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the slap of rain against the barn. The figures didn't respond. They simply watched, waiting. Then one of them stepped forward, breaking from the shadows. A tall, hooded figure, face obscured. Its presence was commanding, malevolent, and Josiah felt an instinctive chill crawl up his spine. He raised his stick defensively, ready to strike if needed. "They belong to me," the figure said, voice low, cold, and resonant, carrying across the yard. "Return her, now, or you will pay the consequences." Josiah's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you are, and I don't know why you're here, but I won't send her anywhere. Not to you." The figure advanced, and suddenly, the shadows around the ranch seemed to pulse with movement, almost as if the darkness itself had come alive. The woman screamed from the doorway, and Josiah spun toward her just in time to see her flinch violently as though the shadow had tried to reach her through the walls. "You don't understand," she cried, voice shaking. "They'll take everything if you don't listen. They're not human, they never were." Josiah felt a cold resolve harden inside him. He had faced storms, wolves, and men with intent to kill, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. And yet, despite the terror radiating from her, despite the weight of the unknown, he refused to back down. He was a protector, and he had made a promise. The hooded figure paused, tilting its head as though considering him, and then a low, guttural growl emanated from the tree line. Shadows twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that defied natural movement long. Limbs, distorted faces, eyes glinting in the darkness. Josiah realized with sinking certainty that her fear had been accurate. The danger wasn't just approaching, it was here. He took a deep breath, planting his feet firmly in the mud. "You won't take her," he said, voice strong, carrying. "Across the rain-soaked field. Not while I'm standing." The hooded figure's response was a laugh, cold, hollow, impossible to ignore. The shapes in the shadows advanced slowly, encircling him and the farmhouse, feeding off the fear that radiated from the woman and the charged air around them. Inside the farmhouse, she whispered under her breath, words Josiah didn't understand, but they carried a rhythm that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. He realized then that she wasn't just a victim, she had her own power, subtle and unknown, enough to make the attackers hesitate. The night stretched, taut and heavy, filled with the hiss of rain, the snap of branches, and the low murmur of the unseen enemy. Josiah knew that the first confrontation had begun, and that the ranch's home, his life, had become the stage for a battle far larger and more terrifying than any he had ever imagined. And as he gripped his stick tighter, heart pounding, he understood one undeniable truth. Protecting her was no longer a choice. It was survival, and it would demand everything he had. The storm had passed, or so it seemed, but the air around the ranch was thick with tension, a residue of the confrontation that had left Josiah both unnerved and alert. The woman had retreated to a corner of the living room, knees drawn up, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Her presence pulsed with an energy that was at once fragile and fiercely protective, like a shield she was unwilling to lower. Josiah knew she was preparing for something, but what? He still did not fully understand. He moved cautiously toward the corner where she crouched. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and fearful, but there was an urgency there he could not ignore. "There's something you need to see," she whispered. "Something I've tried to hide. I should have told you before." Josiah's jaw tightened. He had been promised truths before, half-truths and omens of danger, but he had learned to rely on what he could see and touch. Still, the urgency in her tone left him no choice. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with caution. She rose slowly, moving toward the back of the house. There was a small room she had avoided since arriving, its door half hidden behind stacks of firewood. She hesitated at the threshold, glancing over her shoulder at him as if seeking permission or perhaps absolution. Josiah nodded silently, urging her to proceed. With trembling hands, she lifted a cloth covering an object in the center of the room. Josiah stepped closer, lantern in hand, and froze. Beneath the cloth lay something that defied reason. A figure or part of one twisted unnaturally, pale and contorted, with marks etched into its skin like runes, dark and jagged. It was alive, in a way that was both human and not, breathing shallowly, eyes closed, lips moving in silent murmurs. Josiah's heart hammered in his chest. The air itself seemed to thrum with a presence, an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "This," she whispered, voice breaking, "this is why I ran. They're hunting me. They'll take me back if they find me. They'll take this. And if they do?" Her voice faltered, tears streaking down her face. "It's not just death. It's worse." Josiah swallowed hard, forcing his mind to process the impossible. He had encountered danger. Yes, and threats, but never something that existed in a space between life and some other dark reality. "What is it?" he asked carefully, his voice low, almost reverent. She shook her head, hugging herself. "I don't know exactly. I only know they gave it to me or I was bound to it. It's why they want me back. It protects me in a way, but it also marks me. If I go back, they'll know. And if they know—" Her voice broke completely, and she sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. Josiah knelt beside her, trying to mask the terror that he felt rising like a tide. He had never believed in curses, in ancient bindings, in entities that could lurk beyond sight. But there it was, undeniable, tangible in the room before him. The markings, the unnatural shape, the energy, it was real. He could feel it pressing against him, urging caution, demanding respect. "Then we don't let them get it," he said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, whatever it does, we protect it. And we protect you. I won't let them take you." Her eyes met his, a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "But they're powerful," she whispered. "Stronger than anything you faced. They won't stop." They never stop. Josiah felt a chill seep into his bones. He had faced storms, wild animals, and violent men, but nothing that could alter reality in such a terrifying way. Yet, he also felt something he hadn't in years: resolve. This was no longer just about surviving a storm or defending a ranch. This was about protecting something ancient, something dangerous, and someone who depended entirely on him. "I don't care how strong they are," he said, voice steady. "We'll face them, together, and if they want to fight, they'll find I'm not someone to underestimate." She nodded, trembling but silent, finally allowing herself to lean slightly against him. The weight of the revelation hung between them, heavy and oppressive, but it also forged a fragile alliance born of necessity and fear. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a darker tempest was gathering, one that would not wait for dawn, one that would not forgive mistakes. Josiah turned back to the object beneath the cloth, eyes narrowing. He didn't fully understand it yet, couldn't name it or its powers, but he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever this was, it was the key to the danger pursuing her. And whatever came next, he would face it head on, because now there was no turning back. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees again, carrying a chill that felt almost like a warning. Inside, the farmhouse was silent, save for the shallow breaths of the woman and the strange, pulsing presence of the object between them. And Josiah Kane, the rugged, solitary rancher, knew that the night ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined, and that the revelation he had just uncovered was only the beginning. Night had fallen again, darker this time, as if the heavens themselves were wary of what was about to unfold. The farmhouse, usually a place of routine and comfort, had become a fortress. Every window was locked, every door secured, every corner of the small ranch accounted for. Josiah moved deliberately, checking the fire one last time and making sure the lanterns were ready. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that felt alive, like it was warning him of the danger lurking beyond the tree line. The woman sat near the fire, her knees drawn up, hands clasped over the object beneath the cloth. Her breathing was shallow, measured, almost ritualistic, as if she were drawing strength from it, as if it were a talisman against the darkness that had followed her for years. Josiah watched her, studying the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of fear in her eyes, and the faint determination that had grown over the past nights. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it. They'll be here soon." Josiah nodded, gripping his walking stick like a lifeline. "Then we wait," he said. "And when they arrive, we don't give them a chance." Minutes stretched into hours, the storm outside replaced by an eerie calm. Then, from the tree line, shapes began to emerge, shadowed figures moving with unnatural precision, silent but deliberate. The woman tensed, her fingers brushing the cloth, and Josiah felt the pulse of energy from the object ripple through the room. It was subtle but undeniable, a presence that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. The hooded figure stepped forward first, breaking the ranks of shadows, voice cold and resonant. "Return it, now, or face consequences beyond your reckoning." Josiah tightened his grip on the stick. "We don't give it back. Not to you, not ever." A low growl rose from the surrounding shadows, a sound that seemed to vibrate the air itself. The trees swayed violently, though there was no wind, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, biting at Josiah's skin. He realized with a sinking certainty that these beings were not human. They had crossed a threshold, entering a realm where fear and reality intertwined. The woman whispered a phrase under her breath, words he didn't understand. The object beneath the cloth pulsed, a faint glow illuminating the room, and for the first time, Josiah sensed it wasn't merely a passive presence. It was active, aware, protective. The shadows hesitated at the threshold, their momentum faltering in a way that gave him hope. "Whatever you are," Josiah said, voice low but firm, "you'll not take her. You'll not touch this place." The hooded figure tilted its head, then laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that seemed to draw the shadows closer. "Foolish mortal," it hissed. "You know nothing of the power you face. Step aside or be consumed." Josiah planted his feet firmly. "I said no," he replied. And though his heart raced, though every instinct screamed at him to flee, he felt the growing resolve within him, the same force that had kept him alive through storms, fire, and countless dangers. This was different, yes, but he would not abandon someone who had trusted him with her life. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting unnaturally, merging with one another like liquid darkness. And the woman screamed, raising her hands above the object. The glow intensified, casting the room in sharp, flickering light, illuminating the fear and determination etched on both their faces. Josiah swung his stick, not knowing if it would harm them, but acting on instinct alone. The air vibrated with a low hum, a tension that seemed to stretch the very walls of the farmhouse. The shadows recoiled, just enough to create a momentary gap. The woman's voice rose. chanting something urgent and melodic, words he did not understand but could feel. In his bones. The energy from the object pulsed outward, pushing against the encroaching darkness, creating a barrier that neither side could breach immediately. And then, as lightning flashed outside, illuminating the twisted tree line, the hooded figure spoke one last time, voice sharp and cutting. "This is not over. We will return. You cannot hide forever." The shadows retreated, slipping back into the trees, leaving the farmhouse trembling in the wake of their presence. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the woman's shallow breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire. Josiah knelt beside her, gripping her shoulder. "It's over. For now," he said, though neither of them believed it. The danger had been delayed, not ended. The object lay between them, pulsing faintly, a silent sentinel against the darkness that would inevitably return. She looked up. At him, fear mingled with cautious trust. "Next time." "They won't hesitate," she whispered. Josiah nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "Then next time, we'll be ready." Outside, the wind whispered once more through the trees, carrying a promise and a threat. The ranch remained standing, the object protected, the woman alive. But deep down, Josiah knew this was only the beginning. The storm had passed, yes, but the real battle was still to come. And when it arrived, there would be no turning back. The night stretched on, heavy and tense, as the farmhouse held its breath, and as two unlikely allies prepared for the darkness they knew would return, relentless and unstoppable.